Hey everyone, Chris here, the RC Geek, coming to you from the shop, and we are starting a big new project. This is the new A-1 Skyraider from legendhobby.com. Guys, this is a badass model. It's big. It looks fantastic out of the box. It comes, fully covered. This is an ARF, so we got to go through. We're going to do full assembly. I've got a few things planned in that sense. The model, it's got an 86-inch wingspan. They offer multiple color schemes. This is the Southeast Asia camouflage. They also have a Navy scheme, and I think they've got some others planned as well. And so I'm really excited for this airplane and to go through and do the assembly and flight review for you guys. I've always had an affinity for it. I just love the looks of it. It's just like this huge dump truck. And if you've ever seen one in full scale, they are large warbirds. And so in terms of the power system, I've got a 12S electric setup plan. I've got a big Scorpion motor. We're going to do a 2014 four-bladed propeller, and I've got a full sound system for the model, so I'm really excited to see how that goes. I decided to go the electric route because the cowl is just too small to fit the engine that it needs to without having to hack it all up. So I want to keep the integrity of the cowl, keep the scale looks of the airplane, because I'm going to go through, and this is the stock paint scheme, but I'm also planning to do a full paint on the airplane like we did on the Seagull P-47. So for the assembly, we'll attack the wings first, and then we'll go into the fuselage, and then we'll go through and do the paint work as a separate video, because I want to do a little weathering on this and some panel lining and stuff. First things first, we have to glue in all of the hinges, and I've already done that. And I like to use good quality wood glue to do that because it gives you a lot of time to work with the hinges and get them set right. So I put some oil into the hinge points and then glue the hinges into the surface first. Make sure that I've got them all aligned how I want them. Let those dry, and then I glue them into the main wing and or tails wherever I need to. And then let that dry, and then we're good to go. And so never had any issues using wood glue, never had any failures. I've been using it for a long time. It's a technique that my dad showed me, and it's been fantastic. So anyways, let's get into the assembly of the wing. And so yeah, let's go. Alright, so we're halfway through. We've got the wing all assembled. There's quite a bit of work here, and so I wanted to touch through a few things before we move on to the fuselage. First things first, we're hooking up the flap servos. Now they've got a nice internal linkage there. I ended up using Dubro 440 pushrod hardware. There's a solder link on one end, adjustable quick link on the other end. Those worked out really well. And I do like the fact that they've got that internal linkage. There's plenty of space in the wings, so it's really nice attention to detail there. I used a high-tech HS645 MG servo for the flaps, and the installation was pretty simple. I do recommend, as you are setting this up, use your transmitter as you go versus using like servo testers or something like that, because then that's going to save you time in the programming down the road. And avoid potentially burning up the servo in the process as well. Now once I had the flaps hooked up, I moved on to the retracts. Now I was originally thinking of doing the electric retracts, but ultimately decided to go with air because honestly air has always been 100% reliable, and I can't say the same for electric generally speaking. So The first things first, installed the tires onto the struts. And I should note that, they have the scale brake calipers machined into the back, but there's also an anti-rotation pin that you do have to install, and I just used a light hammer to get it to set flush. You don't want it to actually push through because then it'll catch the wheel hub, so it should be flush to the backside, and that'll ensure that that scale brake caliper part doesn't spin in any way. And so then, there's the axle that goes all the way through, and you do have to trim the back of that axle. So just used a Dremel and a cutoff wheel to do that. So then connecting the air lines to the retracts themselves, I always use some 3-in-1 oil in the tubing at the barb connections. Every single barb connection there is, I use that 3-in-1 oil because that helps to seal everything up and avoid leaks. So once I had the retracts mounted, they just dropped right in. It was onto the gear doors. And I started with the front gear door. So I just have a Dubro flat hinge, and that's epoxied into the wing and then C8 onto the door itself. And then I used 2 small hooks on either side of the strut glued to the door, and then just wrapped a rubber band around the strut that is clipped into those hooks, and that's what pulls that front door closed. And then from there it was on to the main door parts. Now you have a single carbon torque rod with a couple bell cranks on each end tied to a servo that actuates the doors. Now that does work pretty well, but you do want to make sure that you have enough leverage pulling the gear doors closed. I also added some magnets in there to get the front of the doors to really pull closed. It's all shown in the instructions. Now I did do one thing different, and that is the placement of that carbon torque rod. If you are running the electric retracts, you're not going to be able to put the torque rod into the recommended location in the instructions, and so I set it up at the base of the wheel well, and so I wanted to show that in the event that you guys have the electric retracts. And so do take your time in getting the push rods set up right and the lengths and all of that. To hinge the doors, there are 2 slots on either side of the wheel well, and I just use the Dubro flat hinges again. And those are glued to the doors, and then I just used a screw on each hinge inside the wheel well, so if I ever needed to remove the doors, I can. The last thing that I did to get these doors to really fit was I used a heat gun to heat up the fiberglass and kind of form it in the way that it needed to get a tighter fit of the doors. And so that's something you can play with. And also, don't be afraid to sand parts to get it to fit as needed. So I did do some sanding on either side as well, just to make sure everything fit well. Now to set up the gear door sequencing, I've got an iX20, and so I'm just using the built-in gear door sequencer. There's one in that radio, and it's also in the DX radios as well. It ended up being really simple. You can play with the timing and things of that sort to make sure it's to your liking. So then once those were all in, it was on to the pylons and the tanks. Now, the pylons are all glued in place. Ultimately, there are 2 dowels in each one that are glued into the wings and the pylons, and that gets your attachment points. However, I wanted a tighter fit to the surface, so what I ended up doing is before I glued them into the wings, I put some frog tape down and then some packing tape on top of the frog tape, and then placed the pylons in the position that they were intended to go. And then from there I used lightweight Bondo to fill in any gaps that were at the interface between the pylons and the wings. And so then once it was all dried and cured, pulled that up because the Bondo doesn't stick to the packing tape, and that gave me a perfect match to the bottom of the wing. So then you just sand flush the excess Bondo, and then I touched up the paint with Tamiya multi-surface primer, and it was a perfect match. And so once that was done, I glued the pylons all in with 5-minute epoxy. Before I glued them, however, I did insert E-flite payload releases into each one, and then once they were in, it was on to setting up the tanks. Okay, so this is all shown in the instructions. It's really pretty easy to do. With the payload releases in, I put the capture onto each of the tanks, and then I screwed into place. The sway braces, they're also functional, so it's going to keep those tanks from moving around in the air. So once that was all done, that completed the wing center section assembly, and then I moved on to the outer wing panels, and that was just setting up the ailerons, which was really simple, and again using 440 Dubro hardware, the push rods there, and then a high-tech D645. I went with digitals on all of the primary control surfaces because I wanted the extra resolution and the response. Once the ailerons were hooked up, I glued on all of the outboard wing pylons, and there are 6 of them on each outboard wing panel. Now the kit does come with rockets as well. I haven't glued those on yet because I plan to paint the whole airplane, and also I'm considering maybe printing out some bombs to put out there versus the rockets or something like that. And so that finished the assembly of the wing. From here it's onto the fuselage, and then we can get this airplane ready to fly. So let's get on to that. Alright guys, so here is the fully assembled Skyraider. This thing looks so good all together on the bench. It takes up my whole bench, but the airplane, they really nailed the shape, the stance, the gear stance, like the Robart landing gear, everything about it just looks fantastic. And so I'm really impressed by how the model came out. Now, the fuselage assembly started with just installing the rudder and elevator servos, and so those were really easy to do. I used high-tech D645 servos in there, the digitals, and those just dropped right into the servo mounts, which is really nice. Once I had those in, I installed the tail wheel, ran the airlines forward. That just drops into place, held in place by 4 screws, and it's a vertical wall mount type setup in there. So once that was in, I set up the entire air system for the retracts. There was a wood mount provided in the kit that fit the Robart air valve. So I just mounted that in there, and then I mounted a servo in one of the open servo slots in there and set up the retract valve. And then from there, checked all of the air, made sure everything was nice and tight, not leaking at all, everything was operating in the right direction, and finalized my gear door timing and all of that. It's a variable resistance valve, which means that you can change how quickly the gear retract up and down. So play with that to get what you're looking for. I like to have a nice slow kind of retraction because it looks more scale, and so you don't need a whole lot of travel on the servo, so keep that in mind. Once I had the retracts all set up and operating to my liking, the airplane was all together on the bench. So while that was set up, I glued the horizontal tails in place, just used 30-minute epoxy with micro balloons to thicken it up. I used a couple of boxes to prop the tail to ensure that it glued square. And so I just kind of used the weight of the airframe and the boxes to get it in the position that I wanted. So once the tails were glued in place, it was on to connecting and setting up the elevator and the rudders. For the elevators, I'm using Dubro 440 push rod material, and I've got a solder link on one end, and then I have a 440 ball link at the control surface. And then for the rudder, I used the Dubro 440 pull cable system that they offer, and again it was 440 ball links at the control surface and then there are adjustable quick links at the servo. And so that was at the rudder, and then for the steering, it was just looped around the steering arm and crimped in place. Now when you crimp the wire, make sure you don't overdo it. You don't want to cut through, and so you want to crimp it just enough to hold it in place. And then I like to put a little thin S.E.A in there, and that really ensures that it's not going to come loose or slip or anything like that. So once the control surfaces were all set up, it was onto the motor installation in the front end of the airplane. Now, I'm using a Scorpion 5535 motor and the 90mm standoffs that they offer, and that provided the perfect spacing for the motor in the cowl. First things first, I created a drilling template and I spray glued that onto the firewall, drilled the 4 holes for the standoffs, installed the standoffs, and then installed the motor onto the standoffs using Loctite on everything. And that was it. That's all that I had to do to get the motor set perfectly. So then once that was in there, we installed a faux radial engine, and so to finish the model up, I actually had my friend CorsairNet was in town, and he helped kind of get this past the finish line, and so he did all the paint work on the radial, and then we just hot glued it to the standoff mounts, and worked out beautifully. And then once that was in, installed the sound system speakers up in the front. I have a couple of plywood blocks at the base on the firewall, and then a half bulkhead that we cut out of plywood to mount the forward part of the speakers. And so then it was onto the cowl. Now to install the cowl, you actually have to install the exhaust ring onto the firewall first. Once that is on, you use some masking tape to mark the alignment of the holes. You slip the cowl in place, drill the 4 holes all around in the cowl for the mounting screws, and then just screw it into place. The prop on the front is a Bela 2014 4-blade prop. It looks amazing on there. The final thing was that the airplane has a really nice cockpit kit that's included with it. It builds really nice. You just follow the instructions. It's all pre-painted. You just have to cut and trim the parts as needed. And it came out really, really nice. Again, my friend CorsairNet, he did all of the cockpit work in there to make sure we could get this thing done. And then the pilot in here, he has a servo-operated head, and I've got one of my random servo motion generators in there, getting him looking around as you know, he's cruising in his SPAD. So once that was on, we glued the canopy on with canopy glue, and that pretty much finished the assembly of the model. Now to finish it all up, we did decide to put the kit markings on for the initial flights. They do look quite good on the airplane. They're just peel and stick, so you just pull them off, stick them where you want them to go, and they stick really well on the airframe. One thing to note about the shark mouth, though, is that it's kind of difficult to get it to lay down around the complex curves of the cowl. So if you have a heat gun, you can heat it and to help kind of stretch it and form it around kind of the radius of the cowl as needed. So keep that in mind, but otherwise the rest of them went on super easy. And then to finish it all up, I did do some airbrush exhaust stains just because it's such a characteristic part of the Skyraider. It just kind of needed to happen. So once it was all together, it was onto the radio setup, and so I have 2 6S Spectrum Smart 7,000 milliamp hour batteries. Those are pushed all the way forward through this hatch area. In addition, I've got a 20 channel PowerSafe receiver in here as well. You don't need nearly that many channels. I've got 2 lithium iron ferrite packs, 3,000 milliamp hour apiece. One pushed all the way forward on top of the batteries, and the other one at the other end of those 7,000 milliamp hour batteries, and that ended up giving the CG about perfectly. It's at the forward range as recommended in the manual, and we'll start there, see how it feels, and we can move back if needed. Also, the instructions provide dual rate recommendations. They have a high and a low rate, so what I ended up doing is I set their high rate as my high rate, their low rate as my mid rate, and then I set a lower rate even lower than that because I have triple rates on the radio. So I would recommend doing a similar thing. And so that pretty much wrapped up all of the assembly of the airplane looks amazing on the bench. I love how it came out. The camouflage is really well done. It's just iron on covering, but they've really done a fantastic job with it. The airplane does come with rockets, and it does come with drop tanks. I haven't put the rockets on yet because I do plan to paint the airplane, of course. I do recommend take your time. The airplane does assemble really well. It's not hard to assemble, but it does take some time to do. But you are rewarded with an amazing looking model, and it's a great size, and I can't wait to get it out to the field and fly it. So next time we'll be doing a full repaint video. We're gonna paint it, add some panel lines, add some weathering, so I wanted to do a dedicated video for that, and then from there we'll give you guys my flight review. So that's it for this video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to follow along on social media at the RC Geek, subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you at the field. Brent Hecht, extraordinaire at work. So would you say hot glue is
Hot? It's the best. And if Chris Wolf will put hot glue on one of his airplanes, I'll use it.
It's approved.
All the time.
Just glue the whole thing together with hot glue.
That's right, baby.
Do it.